It's time for the Rick Smith Show.
I want you to get up now. I want all of you to get up out of your chairs. I want you to get up right now and go to the window, open it, and stick your head out and yell, "I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore!"
I don't want to abolish government. I simply want to reduce it to the size where I could drag it into the bathroom and drown it in the bathtub.
You bet I cut the taxes at the top.
How dare you? How dare you? Go ahead, make my day.
The Rick Smith Show starts now.
You are listening to the best of the Rick Smith Show. If you have any thoughts, any questions, any comments, we'd love to hear it. You can email me, rick@thericksmithshow.com. Thanks for tuning in. And welcome, brothers, sisters, working class heroes. This is the Rick Smith Show. Thanks so much for being here today on the big program. Lots to get to, lots to talk about. What a week it's been, really. Honestly, while we were focused on Donald Trump being laughed at the UN, the political theater around the Kavanaugh confirmation hearing, Rosenstein's employment status, trade wars, Russian hacking, Bill Cosby sentenced to 3 to 10 years in prison, and really the continued assault on women who have had the audacity to speak out. And that was just the past week. What we've also seen is legislators across the country carrying out the American Legislative Exchange Council's extreme anti-worker agenda. And interestingly enough, also this week, ALEC held its big 45th annual gala extravaganza at the Trump International Hotel in Washington, D.C. Pander much? And while they were partying, the legislators in Pennsylvania, where I live, were pushing the anti-worker poison in the form of multiple bills designed to pay construction workers less by attacking prevailing wage, again, pushing preemption laws, making it illegal for communities to require employers to provide sick time or adopt equal pay provisions. Also, a bill to allow employers to ask their employees to sign away their workers' compensation rights. Also, another bill that would outlaw the state from allowing employees to pay their union dues via paycheck deductions. I guess United Way, you're next. Also, a bill that would greatly expand the union resignation window. Another ALEC beauty. And the thing is none of these pieces of legislation are going to make workers' lives any better. None of this makes work safer. None of this increases wages. It doesn't create better working conditions. And honestly, they're not supposed to. It's really about silencing workers' voices and swinging that pendulum further in the favor of corporate interests over the interests of workers and their families. And it's interesting to me, the preemption laws are one of those, I get the anti-worker stuff, hold down wages, steal benefits, destroy retirement, destroy opportunity. I get that coming from Republicans. What I don't get is the preemption, because they tell us that they're the party of smaller, less intrusive government, of local government. Get big government out of our lives. And yet here they are pushing a piece of legislation that would tell communities, no, you can't pass minimum wage laws. You can't pass paid sick laws. You can't pass equal pay laws. You can't pass anything without us up here at the state level telling you what to do. Now, I'm in favor of the state making conditions better, raising the floor up, saying, no, we want more communities where employers are forced to pay sick leave or higher minimum wage or equal pay or have safer working conditions. For me, you would expect that. But from a Republican, pushing these kind of poison laws kind of goes against the ideology unless you understand it as I do. It's about destroying working conditions in this country and really pushing more people into desperation. And you go, Rick, that sounds hyperbolic. 40 years of a record of destroying the working class of this country. It is that simple to me. And when I look at the assaults on, prevailing wage, on minimum wage, on all of this stuff, you can only come to that conclusion that these are people who so hate work that they value, the people who are, the hard day's work to them is moving money from the right pocket to the left. And the person who's out there, with the shovel digging a ditch, or the person on the road crew, or the person swinging a hammer building a house, or driving a truck, or climbing the phone pole to make sure the wires are right, those people don't matter. We're going to push policy, I guess, is the theory, push policy to make their lives much more difficult. And it's not just on the state level here in Pennsylvania. It's all across this country, and it's on the federal level as well. This kind of anti-worker fervor that the Republicans have internalized. I remember a time when Republicans actually stood up for workers. I remember a time when there were actually some pro-union Republicans who believed that, a fair day's work should come with a fair day's pay. Yet what have we seen for the last, couple of decades? An assault on the working class of this country. An attempt to silence the voices of workers and their families. And it just doesn't stop, there at the workplace. It also happens to our kids, also in Pennsylvania. And this just blew my mind. There's a guy named Will Tallman. He's been a state representative for, several years from Adams County, which is, a small county in the center of the state. A very rural area. He actually sent out a memo to the 203 members of the state house looking for support for a bill he calls the Teachers Code of Ethics. The Teachers Code of Ethics. So not only is this about silencing teachers, it's about actually silencing students as well. Now, in the memo, Will Tallman said that his bill would prohibit public school teachers from endorsing, supporting, or opposing candidates or incumbents for local, state, or federal offices. Can't do it in the classroom. No. On the job, teachers could not discuss enacted or pending legislation, regulations, executive orders, or court cases involving any level or branch of government. Nothing. Can't talk about it. They can't talk about activities that hamper or impede law enforcement actions or military recruiters on campus. Now that, to me, that little caveat thrown in there, as someone who has children in the public schools, as someone who understands the law is already in place that gives military recruiters my kid's phone number and address and access to all of their records for the express purpose of convincing them that they need to join the military. Now, if you want your kids to join the military, that's great. If you go into it with your eyes open, fantastic. But are you okay with them having all of your kids' information and going around you? Are you okay with that? I'm not. And I actually learned about this from a teacher who said that's the law. We have to give them all of this information. Are you okay with silencing a teacher's ability to say, hey, look, parents, hey, kids, this might be coming. You might be getting a phone call from a military recruiter. Will says, well, we're going to hush those teachers up. In his in his memo, he says, quote, our K through 12 school teachers should not be using their classroom time spent on political or ideological indoctrination. He goes on in the memo saying, doing so takes time away from instruction in the academic foundation subjects of mathematics, science, English, history, and civics. Yes, civics. And prevents our students from receiving a high-quality public education for careers in the global high-tech economy. But understand, he's perfectly okay with using the Bible as a science book. Now understand, this has no chance of becoming law. This is Will Tallman's swan song. This is what he has spent a lifetime of public service dreaming up. This is his swan song. This is the legacy he wants to leave. He claims that any teacher who would break the law would be suspended, lose their state license to teach in that state. He also claims that there are 4 states across the country who have enacted similar legislation, although he was unable to choose even one of the 4. Maybe going back to school and learning a little bit about doing research before you put something out would be a good thing. Now, I was thinking about this in my life, going back to school, and thinking about when I was a kid in school. I don't remember Donna Stevens in math class ever saying, okay, 2 + 7 is, those Republicans are horrible. I don't remember that. I don't remember, my science teacher, going, okay, we have AU is gold, H2O is water, and GOP is horrible. I missed that. I could have missed the day. I missed a little bit of school as a kid, but I don't think so. Now, I do remember talking about politics in government class. I remember, James DeSillo, my teacher back then, talking about politics, and we knew he was a Republican, and a conservative one. In fact, he actually was the first person to lay out the Paul Weyrich, we don't want everyone to vote line to us in class. Now, he did it in a very kind of facetious way, kind of a, hey, don't be stupid way. But, there were a couple of things I still remember from, 100 years ago in his class where he was actually right. He was insightful, but he was very open and honest about being a fairly conservative Republican. He was very clear about, when you turn 18, don't bother voting. Stay away from the polls. You don't know anything yet. This way, my vote is much stronger. That was one of his lines. And also, there was the other one. Someone had asked, hey, you're a Republican. How do you decide which side of this aisle you're on? And he gave what I thought was probably one of the most cogent arguments about where the parties are. He said, look, the Democrats are the party of the very poor, and the Republicans are the party of the very rich. And you in the middle, you got to figure out which ones you want to pay for. Are you closer to being rich or closer to being poor? And I thought it was an interesting way of thinking about it. Now, he did go on to say, that's very simplistic, and, there's a whole bunch of nuance and policy, and he was very thoughtful and detailed in his political thought, which I really credit for the way I think about politics and the way I think about how things are framed and how they're put right out in front of us. Because, again, he was a conservative Republican and was very open and honest about his positions. And this was during the Reagan years where, I was not a Reagan supporter. But here again, it's what scares me is this kind of political silencing, this kind of hit job to where we can't talk about this stuff. We can only shout at each other. We can only scream platitudes past one another. We can't have actual debate. In school is the perfect place when you're young and you have ideas, and debate and learning how to debate should be something we should be pursuing and pushing. A piece of legislation saying, no, we actually want debate in government and civics classes. We want kids taking more government courses, more civics courses, more thinking courses. I remember a teacher who was the most popular teacher in school. His name was Ron Zutti. By far the most popular teacher in school. History teacher, taught this great elective course called American Life Today. Still remember it, 30 some odd years later. He, at the moment we took the class, it was all about the political world in which we lived. It was all about how things were framed, how what we were seeing on TV was presented, how politicians looked at issues and how things were, and it made us aware of what was going on around us. This kind of education is imperative. It's imperative for a citizen's democracy. It's imperative for this wonderful experiment of self-governance. We have to have the insight, the ability to evaluate, the ability to debate and express our views. We have to be able to hold our, political leaders accountable when they're spewing BS. We have to be able to do that. Sadly, what's gone on in this country is we've gotten into our camps and we just throw bombs at each other. And it's all about my team winning. And the Kavanaugh thing is right there front and center, as is the Rosenstein thing. It comes down to which team are you on? And I like to believe, because of those people that I had the privilege of sitting in their classroom and hearing their political views and hearing how they evaluate things and guiding us to think about things differently, that I'm better for that. I'm better for the political discourse that we were able to have, even though I was just a young snot kid. It gave me the ability to think about things and say, well, hold on, step back. Maybe we should not just have teachers doing this in schools. Maybe we should be holding continuing education classes for every voter and every citizen in this country. Maybe that would be a very good piece of legislation and a legacy that I'd get on board with you on. But this idea of silencing teachers, ridiculous, nonsensical, and expected from the Republicans. Just my thought. I'd love to hear yours. You can email me, rick@thericksmithshow.com. Again, looking at how things are framed, looking at how things are presented to us. When we come back for break, Josh Bivens is going to be here to share some thoughts on the frame that, tax cuts create jobs. We're going to get rivers of gold and honey out of the latest tax cut hoax and all of the myths that we've been sold, since the Reagan era forward. Quick break. Right back. Stick around. So we've all heard reports about how the Republican pushed Tax Cuts and Job Act of 2017 has been this major success. It's been everywhere. How it was going to raise wages. It was going to afford workers huge bonuses. We were going to see these, in fact, lots of reports of big bonuses. And I said from the very beginning, what we were witnessing at that moment was really a well thought out PR campaign by the tax cut crowd to reinforce that myth that tax cuts will actually benefit the working class. Tax cuts for the 1%, the millionaires and billionaires. If we make them richer, somehow it will trickle down to the rest of us. Reality, they don't. And here to share some light on and shed some light on the great tax cut hoax of 2017 is Josh Bivens. Josh is the director of research over at the highly respected Economic Policy Institute. Josh, thanks for taking time for us.
Thanks for having me.
So, we were told every worker was going to get $4,000. You remember back in October of 2017, Trump in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, in front of the big giant truck said that his Council of Economic Advisors estimated $4,000 in pay increases for every American household. Has that happened?
So it definitely hasn't happened. We know a couple things. We know one, the even if you believed sort of the textbook argument for why cutting corporations taxes would eventually boost workers' wages, that's a process that's going to take time. My guess is it'll never happen for reasons we can go into, but even the big defenders of the tax code will say, yeah, that dynamic will take a while. But, it was 2017. The tax cut hadn't even passed into law. They needed to brag about something. And so they just started seizing on any random bonus that a company gave any worker in that year and said, oh, look, it's a down payment on the wage increase you're getting from tax cuts. But bonuses happen every year. They happen before the tax cut. They happen regardless. So I think to agree with you, I think you just saw this PR campaign to grab any year-end bonus that any company gave and say it was because of the tax cut. And it was always preposterous, but now we know we have some data showing just how preposterous it was.
Yeah, and I would argue that even a couple of places that may not have given the $250 that we had seen press releases on, did it for purely political reasons. Because look, they got a massive windfall. I mean, you're talking huge amounts of money in their pocket, and it had to look like they were at least willing, to share a little bit, even just a tiny bit.
No, I think that's totally right. So on the one hand, it's the administration who wants a PR win, but it's not like the corporate class generally was not on board this tax cut and didn't want to help them get that PR win. So I think you had tons of corporations who, give bonuses every year at the end of the year. And magically in 2017, they said this one is because of the tax cut. The one we gave last year that was like the exact same size, who knows why that happened, but this one was because of the tax cut. And then you're right. Some may have even decided to throw some pennies at their workers as a down payment on getting the tax cut through Congress, because like you say, the benefits to the equity holders, the capital owners, the people who run the corporation are just utterly mammoth.
But here's the thing. You know what those bonuses weren't? They weren't wage increases. At the end of the day, a bonus is great. A little one-time, little bit in your pocket is not a bad thing. But at the end of the day, it's not a sustained wage increase for a career.
No, that's exactly right. I mean, what you want, for the reason you just said, you want an increase in salary that sticks for the rest of your career and adds up. Bonuses are great. They're sort of a pale imitation of a wage increase. But now we even know data has come out on what happened in 2018. The bonuses didn't even really happen. Like if you compare bonuses pre and post tax cut, they just did not budge. Basically 38%, 39% of American workers get a bonus every year. That was the same in 2016, 2017, and 2018. There's no big boost because of the tax cut. And if you look at the total amount of bonuses given in the first quarter of 2018 after the tax cut relative to before the tax cut, you're talking about an increase of like 3 cents, which is basically inflation. So even the bonuses, pale imitation of wage increases, but they didn't even get spurred because of the tax cut.
Yeah, but at the end of this, we hear Donald Trump all the time, talking about how wonderful the economy, the best economy ever, the best stock market ever, the best everything ever. And yet we've seen wages actually not just stagnate, but when compared to inflation, actually declining over his tenure. And working people still struggling and still, fighting just to make ends meet.
Yeah, I would say a couple things. I mean, one, so President Trump inherited an economy that had been steadily recovering for about 7 years before he took the reins. The fact that in his first year and a half, he didn't manage to completely derail it is sort of congratulations so far, but we'll see. Two, I would say even I'm a little surprised that there hasn't been more upward pressure on wages, given that unemployment has now been relatively low for a while now. I think part of the reason why we have not seen that wage growth is because we've spent the past couple of decades trying to kick out anything that supported bargaining power or leverage for most workers in this economy. And so we now need just white hot labor markets before workers feel empowered at all to get anything. And that sort of long run structural decline in the things that can support workers' wages, we know Trump and his administration are just working overtime to reinforce those. Right. With all the rules he's made, the Supreme Court decision that took away public sector employees' ability, didn't take it away, but made it much harder for public sector employees to organize. So I think in terms of that long run effect on American wages, the actions of the Trump administration so far have just been unambiguously bad. And even a 4% unemployment rate, which he largely inherited, hasn't been enough to make up for that and push wages up.
Now you study this stuff, and this is your world. Can we now at some point say that these myths that we've been force fed for 40 years, like tax cuts create jobs, and the invisible hand will rise wages, and a tight labor pool is going to raise wages? Can we officially at some point say that that's bunk, that they're dead, and let's kill them off and say, look, the only way that wage increases happen is when workers demand and have the power to demand higher wages?
Yeah, I think that's largely right. I mean, I think what we now know, and even now, I would say a much wider group of people know this now, like economists who 10 years ago would have been very skeptical about, saying I like unions. They now realize that a key reason why wage growth has been so flat, even when unemployment is low, or even when other indicators say wage growth should be going okay, is exactly the decline in workers' leverage and power. And the number one thing that gives workers leverage and power is the ability to form a union. I think other measures as well, other policy issues as well. We have a federal minimum wage today that is still about 25% lower than it was than in inflation-adjusted terms in the late 1960s, even as the economy's productivity has gone up about 80%, even as low-wage workers are much more educated and experienced. So between unionization, between just savaging the federal minimum wage, between allowing unemployment to sit too long in the name of fighting phantom inflation, all this in the end shouldn't be a surprise. We've basically had policymakers trying hard for 40 years to keep wage growth from happening, and they've succeeded. If we want that to reverse, we need very different policies and probably different policymakers.
Yeah, you could break out the Bush banner, mission accomplished. They've done exactly what they wanted to do. And you make an interesting point. I mean, I've been saying for a long time, it comes down to the policies that we've pushed. And over the last 40 years, it's been all anti-worker policies. Here in Pennsylvania this week, what we saw were a whole bunch of anti-worker pieces of legislation moving through the legislature. Even though they don't have a snowball's chance of passing, it's still this constant attack, this constant drumbeat on prevailing wage, on workers' compensation, on unemployment, on, you name it, the entire no rights at work agenda front and center as Republicans. And I hate to be this partisan, but it's the Republicans who are pushing this agenda.
That's right. I mean, I would say for way too long, Republicans pushed that agenda really hard and Democrats did not push back. A good friend of mine, Jared Bernstein, an economist, he has the line of, if only Democrats liked unions as much as Republicans hated them, we may have actually made some headway in protecting them over the past couple of decades, but we didn't. You had the Republicans who hated them and tried to crush them, and Democrats who were not that in love with them. Luckily, I think some of that is turning around. I think lots of people, mostly Democrats, are realizing the importance of unionization for actually boosting living standards for most people. Hopefully it's not too late in the game, but it's pretty late in the game. But I think for too long, like you said, it was a Republican push that didn't have a strong enough pushback. Hopefully we can rally and get that pushback going.
Yeah, I mean, there's just so much bad that you hope at some point that things turn the corner, because you're right. I mean, right now people are looking to unions going, okay, now how do we fix what's been screwed up for the last 40 years at a time when unions are basically been hobbled?
Yeah, I mean, it's never too late to start trying to do the right thing on policy, but I'd much rather be starting from a position where we had not allowed just decades of attacks on workers' right to organize to have really settled in. I mean, I think policies matter a ton. If you look at, a lot of people want to blame stuff like globalization or technology for why unions are no longer, all that powerful in the U.S. economy. You look at other countries like Canada, Germany, that have been exposed to the same forces of globalization, sometimes even more exposed in terms of smaller countries like Canada. They have computers in Canada, and yet they also have much higher rates of union density. And what explains the difference is political choices. And so if we make different political choices, we actually can have a more empowered working class in the United States. And I think people now realize wage growth, it's not just about the intersection of supply and demand curves. It's about the power and leverage that workers bring to the labor market. And we need to start doing everything we can to restore that.
No, you're absolutely right. And I look at the Kavanaugh nomination as one of those moments where, there's actually a possibility of repealing most of the policies of the 20th century through court decisions that will come. Because, I point to the National Labor Relations Act. The original writing of the act gave employers absolutely no rights because they understood the employers had all the rights. What it did is it gave employees a little bit of leverage to say, hey, you know what, we're going to band together. We're going to form and join unions to collectively bargain for better wages, hours, and conditions. And guess what? It worked really well. We took a poverty class of my grandparents' generation, and they led solidly middle-class lives. They wanted for nothing, and they retired with a bit of dignity and security. And now with the assault on unions the last 40 years, we're looking into a retirement crisis that's going to smack us right in the face here in the next couple of years.
I think your point on the Supreme Court is really, really key. I think it's an underappreciated part of, obviously the Supreme Court is incredibly powerful across a wide range of issues, and all of them are important. But the economic content of their decisions has been really underappreciated. And in just this last term, you saw it, on the one hand, there's the case in Janus, where the Supreme Court made organizing public sector employees much, much harder. And then another case, they basically said employers have the right to force their workers to sign away their rights to engage in class action lawsuits. So if you work for a firm that systematically discriminates against women or people of color, you have signed something your first day on the job, you didn't even know it, but you signed it, that said, I'm not going to go to the courts, I cannot join a class action, I have to go to a private arbitrator who has this close relationship with the employer, and that's the only access to justice I have. It was a huge issue, this mandatory arbitration, this waiving of rights to do class action suits. Didn't get commented on enough, but it's exactly the kind of decision the Supreme Court makes. And a really interesting thing in that decision was Ruth Bader Ginsburg's dissent, which the whole preamble was about what you just said, the National Labor Relations Act, and just we have labor laws because we take it for granted that it is an uneven playing field when an individual worker tries to bargain with a corporation. In order to level that playing field, we need to use labor law and regulations to actually give them some rights and to really level that playing field. And I think that's an insight that's been lost, it's been attacked, and it's going to be continue to be attacked as long as the Supreme Court is dominated by people with this conservative view of economics.
No, you're absolutely right. And again, the Epic System cases, it was one of the ones you were talking about. And it's not just day one of employment. I actually had listeners to our radio program, contact me and say, look, I was on a job 20 years. My employer came in and said, sign this or there's the door. And, they had no recourse other than to sign their constitutional right to access the courts away, or they were going to be fired on the spot.
Yeah, the only, looking for silver linings, I would say the only silver lining with the Epic Systems case is it can be fixed by Congress. Some of the Supreme Court cases will require another Supreme Court decision to overturn. The Epic Systems case can be overturned by legislation. Congress can just pass a law saying employers are not allowed to do this. I think there's, if there is a different Congress in either the House of Representatives or Senate come November and January, there will likely be legislation introduced to try to overturn that case and say employers are not allowed to force their workers to do this. And that's one of those small issues. It sounds small. It's not a small issue, but it's one of those under the radar issues when there's dozens of them that add up that have just sapped so much bargaining power from American workers. And it's going to require a concentrated assault from progressive forces to roll all of that back. And so I would urge people to, keep an eye on that one. Keep an eye on a bill that will sort of roll back the right of employers to force mandatory arbitration and the waiving of class action suits. I think it could be something we see early if there is a different Congress.
No, I hope so. I mean, at the end of the day, to me, this is the first step towards bringing back yellow dog contracts and signing all of your rights away, whether it's to sue or to join a union or, to minimum wage or, whatever. I mean, when you look at what they've done thus far, the future is, wow, extremely unstable.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, after 40 years of going after sort of every source of leverage that low and middle wage workers have, the other side has had to get really obvious in what they're trying to do. For years, it was sort of like staff the NLRB with people who are just going to give decisions unfavorable to employees. Now they just flat out allow employers to do stuff like sign away your rights to mandatory arbitration or non-compete clauses for if you leave me as an employee, you're not allowed to work for anyone else in my industry. You sign a non-compete clause. There was a time when non-compete clauses were mostly for really privileged workers. The idea was like, oh, they know my trade secrets, and so it makes some sense. Now they try to make fast food workers sign non-compete clauses. And so I feel like after 40 years of going after every margin of worker power, they're now going way out in the open because that's the only thing left. Really bald, incredibly obvious attacks. And hopefully it sparks a backlash. The backlash is overdue.
No, I'm with you. But again, they don't want to let out what's in the secret sauce.
Yeah, it's true. I think that's their dilemma. It's like the only things left to attack is going to be really obvious, but we can't help ourselves.
And again, at some point, I'm hoping at the ballot box, working people get fed up and say enough is enough already as we continue to lay out the absurdity of the conservative economic arguments that we see play out for the last 40 years, and none of them yet have come to fruition. I grew up during the Reagan years. And I remember, the whole trickle down thing. It was going to be great. We were going to give rich people so much money that their pockets would eventually overflow, and it would rain down on us like rivers of golden honey.
That is the theory, and that was it was a complete reboot of that theory that was used to sell the Tax Cut and Jobs Act that passed at the end of 2017.
They tried to sell that? I thought they just rammed that down our throats.
That's a good question. I think they tried to sell it. That $4,000 wage increase figure, that was pretty classic supply side. It was like, you give corporations more money, you let them keep more of their profits, and they'll invest more. They'll invest in more factories and equipment. Like, the real problem with the U.S. economy over the past couple of years has been profit rates are too low. You know, when I look at the data profit rates, I see them being historically high. And so the idea that that was the problem with the U.S. economy was really odd, but that was the supply side playbook, and that's what they tried to sell. I think luckily this time not many people bought it, but it did get rammed through.
The last question I've got for you, because, you know, ultimately this is going to be a policy fight. You know, at some point we've got to be talking about raising tax rates on the very wealthy and bringing more revenue into our government, and also an updated version of labor laws. I mean, you know, 80 years of ossificated labor laws is actually being used against working people. You guys have an agenda that you're kind of pushing to help raise wages and make folks, you know, rebuild the working class, a prosperous working class. I hate to use the frame middle class, but to help rebuild a prosperous working class.
Yeah, we do. We call it the first day fairness agenda, and it's the idea that somebody's first day on the job shouldn't be one where they just sign away so many of the rights that could actually allow them to get wage increases. And so we talked about mandatory arbitration. That's something people sign the first day on the job. We think somebody's first day on the job, they should be signing their union membership card. We think the first day on the job, there should be access to things like paid sick leave and paid family leave, so that a couple months down the road, a family crisis isn't going to force them to choose between keeping their job or being able to care for a loved one. We think the first day on the job, there should be a reasonable federal minimum wage that can actually, you know, have a family out of poverty. And so if you go to our website, epi.org, and look for First Day Fairness, we've got like 15 items in total. And it's basically things that should just be taken for granted in the employment relationship. Just basic rights and standards that we should take for granted, but have been completely eroded by the conservative assault, and we should rebuild some of them and then introduce new rights that we never managed to achieve, like paid sick leave. So look for our First Day Fairness agenda. I think it's powerful stuff to actually rebuild some power for workers.
No, it's fantastic stuff, and I'd love you to come back and share, talk about it. But again, you know, that take it for granted, like my grandparents' generation took for granted that, you know, they were passing on to their children better wages, opportunities, you know, the 8-hour day, healthcare, pensions, defined benefit pensions, none of those crappy 401ks. That's the kind of things I'd like to take for granted once again. But Josh, I appreciate the time. Great stuff.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Good stuff, Josh Bivens. He's the director of research there at the Economic Policy Institute, EPI.org. Lots of good stuff there. Take a quick break. Right back. I'm Rick Smith, and this is Labor History in 2. On this day in labor history, the year was 1932. That was the day the state militia was called into Kincaid, Illinois. 164 high school students had just walked out of the classroom, declaring themselves on strike. They were protesting the school board's use of coal from the Peabody Coal Company. The students walked out in solidarity with their fathers, who were on strike against the Peabody coal mine in nearby Langleyville over wage concessions. The father-son strike, as it was referred to, was one more in a series of protest actions that came on the heels of the founding of the Progressive Miners of America a month earlier. Thousands of Illinois miners had just voted with their feet to repudiate John L. Lewis's UMWA over wage concessions. After their founding conference, new PMA leaders began aggressively organizing non-union mines. They marched into mining towns and ordered non-union diggers out of the mines. They also struck UMWA mines, picketing against the industry standard of $5 a day that had been set by the latest concessionary contract. At some mines, the PMA was able to win the old $6.10 a day wage. Throughout the month, the State National Guard had been called out to a number of mining towns to quell armed conflicts between PMA and UMWA supporters. The Peabody coal mine in Langleyville had been shut down for months by ongoing PMA-UMWA conflict. Now it had reopened under heavy National Guard protection and was the only mine operating in Christian County. The striking fathers were PMA miners picketing the continued mine operations under the UMWA concessionary contract. The years-long Illinois mine wars had just begun. Like what you hear? Check out more at laborhistoryin2.com. So this week, Eric Schmidt, he tweeted out what I thought was kind of an interesting tweet. He said, let's find ideas that can increase the wages of 100,000 low and moderate income workers by at least 10 grand. Delighted, he tweets, to support calls for ideas for a unicorn for the middle class. And then he puts JFF's $1 billion wage gain challenge. Now, JFF is the group Jobs for the Future, and they've put out this idea that, you know what, we need some ideas on how to increase wages, which have been stagnant for 40 years. And the thing is here's a guy who, Eric Schmidt, here's a guy who's worth about $14 billion, asking how we can find, quote, a unicorn for the middle class. And my first thoughts, a couple of observations. First, if it means so much that we do this, that we increase the wages of low and moderate wage workers, where were you while you were the chairman and head of Google and Alphabet Incorporated? Where were you when you were the CEO, when you were the top dog? Where were you in the boardrooms calling for better wages for your workforce? Where were you in the union organizing drive for the bus drivers who move your really brilliant scientists and computer software guys all around? Where were you then? Answer, really nowhere. And then, the other part of this is, where were you politically? Where were you in the world of pushing for policies that would have allowed workers to join and form unions? Where were you then? Because the answer to this question is really very simple. Stop all of the anti-worker abuse. Stop all the legislation. Any politician who brings up gutting wages, destroying conditions, changing maximum hour laws or minimum wage laws, any of these preemption laws, basically anything the Republican-led House of Representatives in Pennsylvania did this week, all of them should be out of office. All of them should be looking for the crummy jobs that they want to create. Now, for those of us in the working world, a unicorn is a mythical creature that kids imagine, but they never actually see. I would, again, prefer something better for workers, something tangible, better wages, hours, conditions that, oh, by the way, unions fight for and have fought for. To me, if Eric Schmidt is really sincere in this, there is one policy. Go back and undo all of the bad attacks on the National Labor Relations Act. Give workers the ability to have a seat at the table and not just a place on the menu. We've seen this movie before. And look, I'm not saying it's going to work out exactly as it did, but we're heading towards a time where almost every working person I talk to, they're struggling. They're struggling mightily. There are things that we should be doing hugely on the policy front. Now, Jobs for the Future is asking, how can you translate this system? How can we transform wage stagnation into wage gains? That's basically this thing. In fact, they kicked it off on the 24th of September, and they are asking for submissions. They write wage stagnation, flatlining and falling wages for low and income workers over the past 40 years is a national crisis. Absolutely agree. The costs and causes of wage stagnation will take short and long-term solutions to fix. Reversing wage stagnation is a domestic moonshot of our generation. Again, agree. They've, like I said, they've moved and launched this $1 billion wage gain challenge to raise the wages, as Schmidt said, of 100,000 workers by 10 grand by 2021. And again, they're taking these submissions and they want ideas. And I think it's a great thing to have and begin the conversation. But at the end of the day, there is one, in my view, that works better than all. And that's give people the power at their workplace to share in the wealth that their labor creates. Sit down across from the table from the boss who, a CEO like Eric Schmidt, $14 billion he's worth? Is he really going to have the authority or the ability to say, sorry, yeah, I know I'm worth $14 billion and I know our CEO salary is off the charts, but we really can't afford that nickel raise. Here's a new magic marker, or, oh, hey, a nameplate. You can put it right there on your jacket. And it looks really sharp. So they're asking for ideas on how to use existing ideas to scale up. And I love that. We're going to scale up wages and jobs. They also want experimental ideas that they can move into the pilot frame. They push a lot of education. The idea of, we need to educate workers. We need job training, more internships, accelerated job training, job sharing stuff. These are the kind of ideas that they're pushing around. Me personally, here's an idea. How about paying a living wage? How about mandating that all employees, if you work in this country, if you go and you punch the clock and you do what's expected of you, if you work hard, you play by the rules, that you do okay and you get ahead, maybe with health care, maybe with retirement, maybe some of that stuff. They also want to look at the structure of work and how people are being compensated. One of the things I agree with that they talk about is ending misclassification. This idea of we're going to have W-9 employees instead of W-2 employees. People who are their own boss, yet wear the other company's uniform and adhere to all of the rules and regulations and are, told where to go, what to do, how to do it, why to do it, when to do it, all of that. But yet, they're their own boss. They also talk about stable scheduling, which I'm all 100% in favor of. Another part that they're looking at is worker agency, and voice on the job and ownership, all things that I think are good. The idea of co-ops, the idea of stock incentives, organizing, all of that stuff combined to create an opportunity for workers to engage in some form of alternative collective bargaining. If you're the owner of the company, there are a lot of co-ops out there that are co-op in name only, where the employees don't really have a say. They get like one vote, and the CEO gets like 100. That's not a true co-op. I'm of the mindset I would love to see, groups of workers joining together and owning the factors of production and sharing equally the wealth that their labor creates, and also pulling down the CEO wage, which, and I'm not being envious here. It's out of whack. The fact that during the 1960s, a CEO made about 20 times what the average worker on the shop floor made because we had strong unions and because those CEOs had to sit across the table from those workers. They made a lot of money. They still did well, but not like today, where you're looking at the average CEOs, somewhere 300 times what the average worker makes. And in some places, like the one toy company, the woman made 9,000 times what the average worker makes. It's insane. It's out of hand. It's out of control. And at some point, you've got to look at this and say, from a policy standpoint, what do we do? From a policy standpoint, how do we encourage people to join and form unions? Look, the polling is off the charts. Right now, unions are in. People are going, yeah, we need that voice again. In fact, I've talked to Republicans who have said, we've been sold the anti-union stuff, but I look at, people who are in unions, and I look at the fact that they make a good wage. They have really, really good health care. They've got defined benefit pensions still, or at least good 401ks that are well managed. And they have some seniority, some security on the job, where they're not just at will and fired willy-nilly for anything. And they're starting to see that and going, wow, well, that's maybe not a bad deal. Maybe that's what we need. Now, as the Jobs for the Future points out, there's an imbalance in the power in the labor market. There really is. The pendulum, as I've said a number of times, has swung way to the side of the employer class. How do you bring that back? How do you reverse 40 years of anti-worker assaults? How do you undo all of the things that Republicans have done and Democrats have allowed them to do? And I think Josh Bivens hit it on the head. I wish Democrats were as strongly in favor of unions as Republicans are in their hatred of them. Because Republicans understand it's power. And it's power to not just have better wages, hours, and conditions for workers and their families, but also power politically to push for strong policies like a higher minimum wage, like access to health insurance, like access to paid family leave. A whole bunch of things that we should be doing, paid sick leave, ensuring that people don't get fired for stupid reasons, ensuring that when someone goes off to fight in the war or they go off to serve their country in one form or another, that their job is there when they get back. There are so many things that we should be pushing for. But what's happening is we're being pushed down a path towards desperation, towards poverty wages, and backwards. I keep saying that the policy that the Republicans want and the policies that I fear a Supreme Court, that a conservative court brings us, is back to the 80s and not the 1980s. Back to the 1880s era of desperation, of company stores, of company script, of the boss being in charge of everything about your life. A lot of people talk about Henry Ford, and I love the Henry Ford story. Henry Ford was a visionary. Henry Ford, doubled his workers' wages, $5 a day, because he wanted them to buy his automobiles, which is true. But to get to that wage, the workers had to submit to a code of ethics, to a moral code. And the Ford goons would come and inspect. Surprise inspections on your home to see if you were leading, a good Christian life. And it's interesting to me that we picked that one part of it, but the other one not so much. So the question is how do we as a country move forward on policies that are going to make workers' lives better? Because we're told, and I believe this, that everyone should work. I believe there's a therapeutic quality of work. I believe there's something in getting up and knowing that you have something to do and a job accomplished and the ability to make one's own way. The ability to earn a reasonable living and to be able to exist in some bit of comfort and leisure. I'm not talking about pure equality where I get to be Donald Trump and grab women by the you-know-what and fly around on private jets and yachts and all that. But I'm talking about being able to take a day off occasionally to play with the kids. Maybe a reasonably new car. Maybe the ability to take a vacation. Oh, I don't know. Maybe when I get sick and have to go to the doctor, it doesn't bankrupt me. The latest Kaiser Foundation survey just came out. The number one thing that working people are worried about, unexpected medical costs. A $400 unexpected medical cost could basically throw, I think the number was like 50% of the folks in this country into financial chaos. And the more you look at the policies we're not pursuing, and this is the real troublesome part, the harder it is for working families to exist. And the more we're allowing employers to use gig employees or their own boss independent contractors who they've misclassified, and the more we see Supreme Court decisions like the Epic Systems cases that take your rights away, the more you see families in chaos. The more you see, and we're going to continue to see, the anger of a working class that is working really hard. American workers are the hardest workers in the world. But they're struggling to get by. And at the end of the day, the only way we turn this ship around, the only way we create that prosperous working class of the past, you know it, by allowing them to join and form unions. To me, that's simple. I'd love to hear your thoughts. You can email me, rick@thericksmithshow.com. What do you think? Is it possible for something outside of collective bargaining and outside of union-friendly policies? Do you think it's possible to raise the wages of 100,000 workers by 10 grand over the next couple of years? Do you think that's possible? Or do you think this is a benevolent dictator saying, we can do that even if I take it out of my own pocket to make it look like we've done something? I'm curious your thoughts. You can email me, rick@thericksmithshow.com. Quick break, right back after this. A new report out by the National Institute on Retirement Security highlights what I think we all already know. And that's quite simply the concept of retirement may be dead for the majority of Americans, thanks to bad policy, corporate theft, the destruction of the defined benefit plan, numerous stock market crashes and corrections, and really just plain poverty wage jobs. National Institute on Retirement Security Executive Director Diane Oakley said in a report recently that the American dream of a modest retirement after a lifetime of work is now a middle-class nightmare. Now, I would argue it's a working-class nightmare. I've always said we need to get away from this idea of only middle-class people expecting to have retirement or reasonable wage jobs. This is a working-class issue. The reality, if you look at the numbers in this study, are scary beyond belief. They claim in this report that nearly 4 out of 5 working Americans are falling short of even the most conservative retirement savings targets. Roughly the same 4 out of 5 have less than 1 year of income in any retirement account. This is the part that just, wow. 1 year, the 4 out of 5 that have 3 of those have nothing, have close to absolutely nothing. The report says 57% or more than 100 million working age Americans do not own any retirement account assets at all. Nothing in an employer-sponsored 401k plan, no IRA, no pension, nothing. In the alert, the National Institute on Retirement Security says while the typical American needs 85% of their income while working to retire on to maintain their standard of living, Social Security only provides somewhere around 35%. That leaves a massive gap. Now, what they're saying is to help fill the retirement savings gap, the Retirement Security think tank says that, what we need to be doing? Expanding Social Security. What we need to be doing is opening up opportunities for employers to buy into low-cost, high-quality defined contribution plans, defined benefit pension plans, or even hybrid plans. The idea that from a policy perspective, we actually do something, I think is really important. I like the idea of what they're doing in California with CalPERS, allowing small businesses to buy into savings plans, pension plans for their workforce. It does a couple of things. One, it helps shore up the pension plan for the state employees and for everybody and lowers the risk. And it gives people who work for small business access to retirement accounts and professionals and people who are not going to cheat them and rob them blind. The problem with our retirement security is that we've given it to Wall Street in a lot of the cases, and they have robbed us blind. So for me, the idea of opening up access to state pension plans and getting more people into them is a good idea. And the idea of expanding Social Security, especially at a time when Republicans are saying, no, we need to end it. We need to cut. We need to destroy the entitlements. I'm telling you, lots to do and a crisis on the horizon. Love to hear your thoughts. You can email me, rick@thericksmithshow.com. Thanks so much for tuning in. We'll see you next week. You are listening to the best of The Rick Smith Show. If you have any thoughts, any questions, any comments, we'd love to hear it. You can email me, rick@thericksmithshow.com. Thanks for tuning in.
Racially and ethnically speaking, I'm truly a global human. Irish, Black, Anglo, Native American, Italian, all that and more. My father always said that our family was Heinz 57, like the brand of steak sauce supposedly made of 57 zesty ingredients. Good enough for me. A great strength of America is our mixed population, continuously fueled by generations of immigrants coming as refugees. Consider the typical story of 16-year-old Friedrich, who fled his tiny German village where he faced a dreary future of poverty. Arriving in Manhattan in 1885 with no money and little education, he was nonetheless greeted by America's open immigration policy and welcomed into citizenship. Friedrich soon prospered, eventually opening hotels and taverns. And God bless America, only 3 generations later, Friedrich Trump's grandson would become president of the USA. Alas, though, grandbaby Donald would not even have let Friedrich in. Indeed, Donald denigrates and has ruthlessly shut out penniless refugees like his grandfather, though such migrants are now more likely to be named Federico and come from Latin America. Trump especially hates a process he calls chain migration, whereby American citizens can obtain U.S. residency for their foreign relatives. They bring their whole family with them, Trump repeatedly rants. Not acceptable, he barked in a recent Twitter tantrum. But, psst, guess who just used chain migration to benefit his own family? Yes, the Donald. In August, the Slovenian parents of Trump's immigrant wife Melania quietly became American citizens through the process their son-in-law so loudly denounces as not acceptable. This is Jim Hightower saying, in Trump world, integrity and consistency aren't virtues. All that matters is, what's in it for me right now?
What do the corporate powers from Wall Street to Walmart have in common? They hate the Hightower Lowdown. You can see why at www.hightowerlowdown.org.
And welcome, brothers, sisters, working class heroes. This is The Rick Smith Show. Thanks so much for tuning in. Today on the big program, lots to get to, lots to talk about. What a Labor Day weekend it was. Hope everyone had a safe, healthy, happy weekend. A little time with the family, a little time to recharge the batteries, because boy, are you going to need it. And what a week it has been. Look, Labor Day weekend for me is, as I said last week, one of those special kind of times where you look back and you remember how you got the weekend, how vacations came about, how the 40-hour work week, the 8-hour day, you can go down the list, health insurance, retirement security, job safety, ending child labor, all of that stuff. For me, that's the time when you reflect on the battles and the wars that were fought so that we could take for granted those things, because we do. We take them for granted. And the email box this week was just inundated with stuff from crazy right-wing people. Not quite sure why the crazy right-wing thought it was so important to tell me that while we have Labor Day, we should have Capital Day. Think about the audacity of someone to say, you know what? You workers, a day for you, too far. We have to honor capital. And as I responded to all of the folks who said, we should have Capital Day and, it should be Labor and Capital Day because we want to, I don't even know what the rationale was, other than to diminish the meaning and the significance of Labor Day. And my response was uniform. The other 364 days a year are Capital Day. We do everything to pander to the very wealthy. We do everything to pander to big business, tax cuts and subsidies, and you name it. We do it because we need to be business friendly. In fact, we screw a generation of workers and students so that we can pander more to big business. Because, and this is one of those things that the great thing about this week for me was I got to have a ton of conversations that you don't have the rest of the year. Like, why do we need labor unions? Why is it that now is an important period in our history? Why, aren't they something that relics of 100 years ago and we don't need those stinking unions no more? Because we're so much more evolved. Because we do have weekends and still something of an semblance of a 40-hour work week and still a little bit of job security, a little bit of safety on the job. Because there's still some rules in place. Now, understand, the Trump administration doing everything they can do to destroy that. And this week we saw the confirmation hearings of Brett Kavanaugh, which will move us right back to the days of the 1880s and 1890s. We will see the repeal of the entire 20th century. And of course, with their textbooks coming out of Texas, I'm sure they'll rewrite that it never even existed. It was a bad experiment. It was horrible. It was terrible. That Social Security and that Medicare and that minimum wage, all bad. It's coming. It's coming. And this is why I thought Labor Day is such an important holiday. Because you get to have those conversations and they flow a little freer. And thank goodness for people who ask questions. And even if they're meant in a ridiculous way, like, hey, why don't we have Capitol Day? Let that sink in for a second. There was actually someone who got the bright idea that said, we should have Capitol Day. The first time I got it, I thought it was a goof. I thought it was an absolute goof. The second time, I'm like, something weird here. Maybe the guy's got 2 emails. Third time, fourth time, what the heck is this? Then you find out it's the brainchild of another one of the right-wing think tanks. This came out of the American Enterprise Institute. It was their little brainchild. So, of course, they put that out to the minions, and the minions catch on to it. And, of course, this is now, see, why don't we have this? And I'm waiting for the movement. I'm waiting for the movement of billionaires and moneyed interests to say, well, damn it, we want our own day. Just bizarre to me on so many levels. But I hope you had a good Labor Day weekend. For me, spent with the family. We did a lot of swimming. We did a lot of, cookouts, stuff like that, as you do. And talking about, hey, how do we move forward? Talking to my kids about, hey, this is what Grandpa did. Hey, this is the history of not just our family, but of our country. And it got me, and I told this story over the weekend to a couple of friends who were saying, I was remembering being in California not too long ago. I gave a speech out there, and there was a girl, and I shouldn't say girl, she was 30, and her mother in the hot tub with us. And the young woman had no idea what a union was. None whatsoever. And I'm still shocked by this. I'm still, stunned by the fact that there's someone who's 30 years old in this country who has no idea, who the Teamsters Union is or was or why it's significant or any of that. I'm still stumped. But even more so that this woman's mother looked at her like she had a third head, not believing that she didn't know, considering the mother's uncle was an organizer for the rubber workers back in the 30s in Akron, Ohio, one of the most militant unions in the history of this country. And just in one generation, that history had been eviscerated. It was gone. This woman had no idea about the history of her family, let alone the history of the country, which again is why I think Labor Day is so important. So that's what we spent a little time doing. And I hope everyone else did too. You're thinking just about your own family. How is it that we live where we live? How is it that we've attained what we've attained? How is it that, and look, I'm a firm believer in hard work, but I also believe hard work should be followed up with reward. And that meritocracy we were led to believe as kids, that if you worked hard, you played by the rules, you got ahead. Firm believer in that. So, bunch of those questions. I'm going to try and answer some of those a little later. Of some of the more lucid ones. Some of the crazy stuff I'm going to steer away from, because you got to wonder. But anyway, back to the weekend. Also, you had John McCain's funeral, which I thought was one of these moments in a nation's history that you honor somebody who I do believe was a patriot, someone who served his country, someone who is worthy of respect, even if you disagreed with his policies, and I did mightily. And yes, I understand he was a hawk, and yes, I understand he was, a conservative and voted along party lines a lot of the time. But I never questioned his patriotism. I never questioned his love for this country. And for me, that moment, the funeral over the weekend, Friday going into Saturday and even into Sunday, you saw, you saw a country coming together. The big scandal was George Bush handed Michelle Obama a piece of candy from that he transferred from his wife. That simple transaction of being nice and going, here, take the mint or whatever it is. That sent the right into just a tizzy, because that kind of decency, that kind of civility isn't allowed to exist. And for a brief moment of time, you looked at this funeral and as a moment of, coming together. And not just mourning the passing of John McCain, which, again, not a big fan of his policies. I watched his daughter's speech and look, my eyes welled up. And I don't like Meghan McCain at all. But I felt for her as a child losing a parent. And to me, I guess maybe it's just I'm able to put that aside, my disdain for her politics, and feeling the humanity. We've all lost loved ones. We've lost parents. We've lost, kids. We've lost. And if we can't identify across party lines on that, I don't know what we can agree on. So for me, the moment over the weekend was, that kind of coming together to where maybe there was a little bit of hope left for us as a society, that maybe we could come back to the public square and agree on something. And I thought that happened. Now, granted, you had the petulant one off playing golf during the ceremony, which is fitting, which is quite fitting. I mean, I'm assuming his portrait, in the White House will be of him swinging a golf club. But I look at that moment, I go, maybe there's hope. And then Monday hits. And we're hit in the face with the Nike Colin Kaepernick marriage, which I took a ton of grief over, because I said, look, I'm a big fan of Colin Kaepernick. I think what he did is heroic. I think what he did was, an honor to humanity. I think he's on the right side of history. But doing it with Nike, I'm not a Nike fan and never will be. This is a company who has a history of labor abuses, a history of exploitation and desperation, and the fact that they've never made a shoe in the U.S. is a problem for me. But you go to these third world countries, you go to these places where they set up these factories, and I know the right wing says, no, we should be pro sweatshop. Think about the argument behind that over Labor Day weekend to argue that we should be pro sweatshop in places like Africa, because at least they'll have jobs, even if they're crummy jobs, and even if they're toiling, 16 hours a day for poverty wages and being abused and all of the things that come with that kind of power dynamic. We should be grateful for sweatshops because we get cheap stuff. The only problem is, I don't know, have you seen a pair of Nikes, the cost of them lately? Not really all that cheap, especially when you're talking about the fact that we're exploiting parts of humanity. So I took a lot of grief over saying that, I've been boycotting Nike for 20 plus years. Wrong side of that argument, evidently for some. While I want to honor what Colin Kaepernick has done and the achievements, the ability to move us forward in a conversation that makes sure that all of us are treated equally. It can't be there with Nike. And that's a problem. But, Monday, the division came back. And it came back in a way that I don't even think you could write the script to have Saturday, Sunday, the kind of unity that was coming out of the McCain funeral into the most divisive thing that you could possibly imagine, which gave the right wing the ability to say they don't honor the flag and all that nonsense. And then into Tuesday, which brought us, Brett Kavanaugh. And good on the Democrats. Finally found a spine. Very happy about that. But you came out of the weekend maybe a little more unified, a little more willing to smile at your neighbor, if you will, to two extremely dividing moments. So I'm hopeful that the McCain funeral and the conversations that came out of that will somewhat, maybe, possibly bring us somewhere together. But my fear is not. I'd love to hear your thoughts. You can email me, rick@thericksmithshow.com. Tell me what you think about all of it. The weekend, McCain's funeral. What did you think of Kaepernick and Nike? What do you think of the campaign? Is it the right one? Or is this one of those moments where Nike has done the math and they think that they can sell more sneakers and underwear and socks and all of that stuff out of appearing to be social justice warriors? Curious your thoughts. You can email me, rick@thericksmithshow.com. Also, don't forget Brett Kavanaugh, the end of the 20th century. Love to hear that as well. Quick break. Right back. Thanks for tuning in to The Rick Smith Show here on Free Speech TV. And be sure to join us every weeknight from 9 p.m. to 11 p.m. Eastern Time at thericksmithshow.com. Follow us on Twitter at Rick Smith Show and like us on Facebook at facebook.com/The Rick Smith Show. Breaking news. Mark this down on the calendar. This week, Amazon's market value hit a whopping $1 trillion. That's right, $1 trillion in market share. They are now the second publicly traded company in the U.S. to reach that stratospheric level. Way up, $1 trillion. Its CEO, Jeff Bezos, worth $155 billion and growing. And the thing that gets me is I look at Bezos as probably the biggest welfare queen ever. Stop and think about in the short period of time that Amazon has been in existence. They have gone from a startup to $1 trillion company, which is one of those amazing Horatio Alger kind of stories of rags to riches of creating $1 trillion company and dominating the world. It's truly the American story. But the other side of that American story is, the welfare queen, the theft, the kleptocracy, what we've seen. You have Jeff Bezos, $155 billion man on top of $1 trillion company. And yet you've got thousands of Amazon workers, the people who created the wealth, the people who go to work every day, punch the clock, load the trucks, pick the orders, do all of that, begging for handouts, relying on food stamps just to put food on the table, needing Medicaid to get just basic health care needs addressed, and of course, public housing to keep a roof over their heads. And all of this just to survive while doing what they're told. Working 40 hours a week, busting their behinds. There's truly something wrong with the picture where you have people who they get up every day, they go to work, they punch the clock, they do what's expected of them. And yet they're still struggling to make ends meet. And we see these stories all the time. This isn't new. This is just another one of those moments where you go, this company full of people who go to work and bust their behinds every day to create the kind of wealth that this company enjoys, and yet It hasn't trickled down. And you wonder why people are angry. This is one of those moments where I go back to the entire 2016 election cycle, where I was saying, look, understand, Democrats, people are angry. People are ticked. People are struggling. What are you going to do to address that anger? What are you going to do to make people's lives better? And I asked it on election night. To all of my labor friends who were just distraught that Trump had won, you go, okay, now will you understand that the anger is real? It's palpable. It's there. And what are you going to do when Trump doesn't deliver? How are you going to use that anger to move us forward as a country? Because look, people are angry, and you see it. And you look at this situation with Amazon, a $1 trillion company, a $155 billion man at the top, and you wonder why people believe the economy's rigged against them, because they've got to go begging for handouts. Their kids have got to go get school lunches just to have something to eat. There's something wrong here. There's something wrong. And you want to talk about welfare? Here it is. You think about the reality that we as a country subsidize low-wage, low-road employers. And we've been doing it for years. And the argument was, well, you know, we believe in work. We believe in the reward of work. We believe in the therapeutic qualities of work, of which I do. I do believe you have to get up with something, with an idea of something to do during the day. The whole idle hands thing. I do believe that. But with that work, with that struggle, with that aching back and those bruised hands and the sweat and all of that should come reward, right? And what we were saying for a long time, well, you know, we need to prop these low-wage economy jobs up, so we're going to subsidize them. And Republicans, seized on this immediately, because you've got other workers who are struggling too, making a little bit more money, but struggling just as much, going, well, why don't we get that? How dare we have to, my taxes paying them? I mean, it's this weird little perverted world that has been created around us. And liberal policies kind of brought us the idea that no child should be hungry, the idea that no one should be homeless, the idea that no one should not be able to get health care, the idea that there should be a roof over the head, clothes on the back, all of those Christian value things that the right, likes to ignore, that liberals seem to want to address and do something about. With that in mind, sought policies to make people's lives better. And in the end, what they did is, well, they've created tons of attack points. And I've always been a believer, because I'm a union guy, I'm a work guy, that what you do should fund your existence. What it is you get up every morning to do, you punch the clock, you go to work, you do all of that stuff, you should be able to afford to exist. Which is why I'm glad to see that Senator Bernie Sanders from Vermont and Congressman Ro Khanna from California have put forth an idea to end corporate welfare. The idea of attacking these employers, and I use that word specifically, attacking these employers who make huge sums of money, massive profits. Their shareholders are happy, wealthy, all of that. And yet their workforce, the people who actually create the wealth, the people who actually do the work, they seem to get shortchanged. And it's one of those moments where it's about time, and I've been calling for this for a very long time. I have people say, well, you believe in the welfare queen. And look, do I care that there are people at the bottom of the economic scale cheating the welfare system? Not really. Not until we address the real problems. And those are the welfare queens sitting in our boardrooms. Those are the welfare queens sitting atop of these huge corporations. We need to end corporate welfare immediately, if not sooner. And I'm thrilled to see that Sanders and Khanna have come forth with a plan to do just that. And it's exactly what I said should have happened a decade ago. You put a tax on these big companies, these big profitable companies. People like Amazon, like Walmart, like United Airlines, and a ton of other ones. equal to 100% of the federal benefits their low-wage workers bring in. So if, there's an associate at Walmart getting $300 a month for food stamps to feed their family, there's a tax for $300 to pay for that. If you're not going to put it out in wages, if you're not going to pay your workers a living, reasonable wage, and as a country, we've got to decide what that is, then we're going to make sure that the subsidies that we provide your employees, we pay for. This idea of giving massive tax breaks to the very wealthy, and then, oh, by the way, sorry, we've got to cut those food stamp programs, is ludicrous. And at some level, we better figure this out, which again is why I'm thrilled to see Khanna and Sanders doing this. It's a conversation that has to be had. It's a push that needs to be addressed immediately because, look, these big companies have grown so large, almost to the point of monopolies, that the mom and pops, they're getting crushed. And any unionizing campaigns that would level the playing field, crushed. I go back and I think about my grandmother. My grandmother worked at a small department store in Cleveland. It was a small little chain. They had, like 7 or 10, maybe 15 little stores in and around the greater Cleveland area. It was called Uncle Bill's, for those who want to go look it up. They were a unionized company. When she retired in 1985, when the company eventually went bankrupt, I think it was 87 actually. She was making $8 an hour, and 85, 87, $8 an hour, full health care, defined benefit pension fund, 6 weeks vacation because she'd been there forever. Paid sick days, paid vision, paid dental, all of the things that generation fought for in this little department store. And all of the workers who were there earned the same wages. There wasn't this mass income inequality. Women didn't get paid less than men. It was contractual. Everyone above boards made a reasonable living. And there were a number of single mothers who were able to raise their families based on that income alone. You stop and think about it. The minimum wage at the time was $3.35 an hour. So you're talking more than double the minimum wage. More than double. For doing, retail work that now is paying just above minimum wage. Only now we're subsidizing it. So you go back to my grandparents' generation, they didn't do that. You earned a living. You paid your way. Your work, what you did, supported your family. You didn't beg for handouts. You didn't be forced into begging for help. Your work provided that. And we need to go back to that. We need to demand employers pay a reasonable living wage. And as a society, policy-wise, we need to be pushing for that. It only makes sense. And I've yet to find a conservative who disagrees with that. I've yet to find one who disagrees, yet they won't push for the policies. They won't push employers to pay a fair share of their profits to their workforce. The people who create it. It's kind of amazing to me. Honestly, it's kind of amazing. Just mind-blowing. Love to hear your thoughts. Email me, rick@thericksmithshow.com. Tell me what you think. You have a story like that? Love to hear it. Thanks for tuning in to The Rick Smith Show here on Free Speech TV. And be sure to join us every weeknight from 9 p.m. to 11 p.m. Eastern Time at thericksmithshow.com. Follow us on Twitter at Rick Smith Show and like us on Facebook at facebook.com/The Rick Smith Show. I'm Rick Smith, and this is Labor History in 2. On this day in labor history, the year was 1932. That was the day the state militia was called into Kincaid, Illinois. 164 high school students had just walked out of the classroom, declaring themselves on strike. They were protesting the school board's use of coal from the Peabody Coal Company. The students walked out in solidarity with their fathers, who were on strike against the Peabody coal mine in nearby Langleyville over wage concessions. The father-son strike, as it was referred to, was one more in a series of protest actions that came on the heels of the founding of the Progressive Miners of America a month earlier. Thousands of Illinois miners had just voted with their feet to repudiate John L. Lewis's UMWA over wage concessions. After their founding conference, new PMA leaders began aggressively organizing non-union mines. They marched into mining towns and ordered non-union diggers out of the mines. They also struck UMWA mines picketing against the industry standard of $5 a day that had been set by the latest concessionary contract. At some mines, the PMA was able to win the old $6.10 a day wage. Throughout the month, the state National Guard had been called out to a number of mining towns to quell armed conflicts between PMA and UMWA supporters. The Peabody coal mine in Langleyville had been shut down for months by ongoing PMA-UMWA conflict. Now it had reopened under heavy National Guard protection and was the only mine operating in Christian County. The striking fathers were PMA miners picketing the continued mine operations under the UMWA concessionary contract. The years-long Illinois mine wars had just begun. Like what you hear? Check out more at laborhistoryin2.com.
Brought to you by the Amalgamated Transit Union, the largest labor organization representing 200,000 transit workers in the United States and Canada. The ATU works to promote transit issues and fights for the interests of its hardworking members and riders.
To highlight my point about the welfare queen, and this is again another one of those moments where you go, we already know, it's just a matter of waking up. Back in July, Politico reported that Oracle Corporation CEO Safra Catz sold about $250 million worth of her company shares, while their product development head, a guy named Thomas Kurian, he sold about $85 million of his corporate shares. And it came on the heels of the company announcing that they were going to be buying back about $12 billion of their shares. You know, classic pump and dump. And hey, you can thank Trump and the GOP and all of that stuff, because look, they lowered the corporate tax rates. They set the table for what we knew was going to happen. We knew beyond a question that these corporate CEOs were going to do just that, buy back tons of their shares, pump up the share price, because hey, you know, people want to be selling them because we can make a ton of money off of it. And as soon as they pump it up, they dump their own and of course cash in mightily. And look, do you blame them? Actually, no. This is why policy has to be smart, and this one isn't. You look at MasterCard CEO Ajay Banga, who also sold like over almost $45 million of their stock in what Politico called the single largest cash out of an executive of the company in at least 10 years. Because, of course, that company announced they were going to be buying back about $4 billion of their own stock. You look at Eastman Chemical. They announced they were going to be purchasing about $2 billion of their own stock back. Their CEO, Mark Costa, he sold something like 55,000 shares of the stock for about $5.4 million. Nice little piece of change if you can get it, right? And of course, thanks to the Republicans and Donald Trump, lower taxes all the way around. And as I said, you know, we knew this was all coming. You know, I talked about this, you know, the entire, you know, what is it, 55 days where they rammed through the tax bill? There's nothing surprising. We've been told, you know, this, if we give the rich people all the money, they'll know what to do with it. And they do. Make themselves more money. And in fact, you know, you remember when they used to make the nonsensical argument that the wealth would trickle down on the rest of us? Do you remember that? I mean, they don't even try to do it anymore. They know that it's farcical. They know that there's no way that was ever going to happen, and we were just dumb enough to buy it. Some of us were dumb enough to swallow it. And the thing that's galling to me, I mean, really, the thing that's galling to me in all of this is they justify it saying, well, this is going to be good for corporate profits. And you hear Trump all the time saying, you know, corporate profits have never been greater. And that's probably true. Corporate profits are through the roof. But is that how we should gauge an economy? By how the winners in our society, how the ones who are, well, politically connected, the ones who won the birth lottery. Is that how we should gauge our economy, on how well off they are, on how big their mansions are and how many mansions they have and how big their yachts are? Is that how we judge an economy? Or should we be judging it based on how are the working people who create that wealth and build those mansions and build those boats, how are they doing? How are the people who get up every day, punch a clock, work every single day to make ends meet? How are they doing? I don't know that we have policy that does that. And in fact, it seems like working people in this country have become a punchline, especially amongst Republicans. And the punchline before Thanksgiving or before Labor Day, quite interestingly enough to me, was federal employees. I don't know if you saw it, but on Thursday before Labor Day, what you had was Donald Trump, and the Republicans, who handed out massive tax windfalls. Massive amounts of money they handed out. And remember, these are the people who are the Tea Party folks. These are the people who we're taxed enough already. These were the people who we need to be fiscally responsible. These are the fiscally responsible people who've blown up our deficits. $1 trillion deficits this year, next year, on into the future. These are the people who during the Obama years, while the economy was in the tank, were saying, no, austerity, tighten the belt, screw those poor people, cut food stamps, cut housing assistance, screw them. And now it's drunken sailor time. Here, rich people, take more. Buy back your stock. Don't worry, you don't have to pay for it. They did this. They passed this tax bill knowing they were blowing a massive hole in the nation's revenue and a massive amount of debt. They knew this. They did it knowingly with eyes open. So what does Trump do once they've blown the federal budget, once they've exploded our deficits and increased our debt? What does he do? How does he get the fiscal house in order? He seeks out to cheat federal workers out of a pay increase. Just days before Labor Day. How wonderful is that? Evidently, the president sent a letter to House and Senate leaders where he wrote, quote, "The country must maintain efforts to put our nation on a fiscally sustainable course. And federal agency budgets cannot sustain such increases. I have determined that for 2019, both across the board pay increases and locality pay increases will be set at 0. Let that sink in for a moment. While you've got the corporate heads and the captains of industry cashing in mightily, while you've got corporations never more profitable, being taxed at a much, much lower rate, we're going to pay for those off the backs of workers who have not seen a raise since 2010. Let that sink in. There is now talk that, and this plays right into the right-wing wet dream, there is now talk that there's going to be poaching from the federal workforce because federal workers who are much more educated than the private sector workforce, because they get into government for service first and then reasonable pay and benefits. And because, look, this is where their passion is. Now saying, look, we got to go find another job. And the fear is on a certain side that we're not going to be able to regulate, that we're not going to be able to hold business accountable, that we're not going to be able to keep our environment safe and our workforce safe, because guess what? The really smart people are going to all be gone because we've starved them out. And this is part of the Republican playbook. You may remember Grover Norquist saying, "I want government so small where I can drag it in the bathtub and drown it in the bathtub." This is playing out right in front of us. And I asked the question, what happened to that meritocracy of work? What happened to work hard, play by the rules, get ahead? What happened to dedication and service and loyalty? What happened to those things? Well, evidently, we got to get our fiscal house in order. And we're going to do that how? We're going to do that by stealing from federal workers. We're going to do what the private sector has been doing for a couple generations now. We're going to steal from the people who create the wealth and do the work. We're going to rob them blind. Because why? We've got CEOs to make happy. We've got campaign cash to get. We got to keep the corporate masters. Got to keep them happy. I find this disgraceful. I find it angering. And the hope is that you do too. And come November, when you march to the polls, come November, when you take to the streets and march to the polls and throw these bums out, this will be one of those reasons why. Love to hear your thoughts. You can email me, rick@thericksmithshow.com. Thanks for tuning in to The Rick Smith Show here on Free Speech TV. And be sure to join us every weeknight from 9 p.m. to 11 p.m. Eastern Time at thericksmithshow.com. Follow us on Twitter at Rick Smith Show and like us on Facebook at facebook.com/The Rick Smith Show. So I wanted to bang through a couple of emails, and thank you for everyone who sent emails this week. Again, rick@thericksmithshow.com is how you can get a hold of me. I do answer all emails personally and even use some of them on the air. Dennis writes, I'm an old man and I want to take you back to a different time. When I was in community college student in the early 60s, I worked summers and one winter break for the New York Telephone Company in New York City, disconnecting and removing telephones. I suspect the opportunity came through the Queensborough Community College when I was studying electronics. When I graduated with an associate's degree in applied science, I went to work full-time for the telephone company. I knew basic electronics, but not the telephone systems. They had a basic training program to teach me their methods. They also talked about a three-legged stool, one leg for the company, another for the customer, and a third for the employees. Any one leg that is misused, the stool falls over. Dennis says, I suspect that stool has been burned in the fireplace long ago. And, Dennis, I don't disagree with you. The reality is the pendulum has swung so far to the side of capital and corporate interests that most often the consumer and the worker are left in the dust well behind. And the training program you talked about, also something of the past. I've yet to hear many people tell me they got out of school and a company took them on and trained them. Most companies today, they want it all done. They want you to know everything you need to know on day one. So we've got interesting times ahead. But thanks for the email, Dennis. Bob writes, unions are a thing of the past and totally unnecessary in today's economy. They're a throwback to an economy where hand workers were needed to accomplish anything. Today's workforce, he writes, is much more educated and capable of negotiating their own agreements without having to pay some union to do it. Stop living in the past and get with the future. Bob, I don't know if you've noticed, and this is one of those moments where I'm not quite sure if you've been paying attention or if you're in kind of a bubble, but right now, most of the people coming out of college, most of the educated workforce, they're struggling. There's a lot of misclassification. There's a lot of wage theft that's going on. Hey, you can be your own boss. You can be an independent contractor. Of course, you're going to work for poverty wages with no benefits. Jobs that used to be the high-skilled jobs, that used to be the ones that you needed advanced degrees for, like a college professor, or you might need a PhD. Back in the old days, they paid a reasonable wage, a decent standard of living. Kid tweeted out the other day that he's paying $50,000 a year to a university where the adjuncts are making $3,000 a class. So I'm kind of confused at the thought of, those are something we needed in the old days. Those uneducated workers. You know what those uneducated workers back there understood? They understood power. They understood collectively standing together gets them better wages, hours, and conditions when they stand and fight for them. Begging individually never got anyone anything. And this idea that you're capable of negotiating your own good deal, some occasionally, but for the vast majority of folks, and I know this is hard to hear, there's no negotiating. You get what you get, and that's it. There's no negotiating. A guy told me he got that I know got a job working in a computer setting. And I said, did you get to sit down and negotiate your wages? Well, he said they asked, how much I was looking for. And then they undercut me by $10,000. So there was no real negotiation. This idea, this fallacy that, we as individuals are so hyper skilled and so well educated that, we're going to be able to get this the corner office. Because that's what I was raised believing. You went to college, you got a degree, you got the golden ticket to the middle class. And we would all have corner offices. We'd all wear shirts and ties and, hour-long lunches. It was going to be great. Only that path to utopia has been paved with poverty wages. Ask any college professor. But I love the thought, hey, thanks for thinking, or not. Sandy writes, and again, another union buster. Sandy writes, unions only protect the lazy and the stupid. If unions would work with the company to get rid of the dead weight, they would be better off. If I were in charge, Sandy writes, I'd fire at least half the people I work with. If you do your job, you'll never need a union, blah, blah, blah. I hate to work with you, Sandy. If you're going to fire half of the people, there's part of me that thinks maybe your opinion of yourself a little inflated. And I find people who take that position that it's, it only protects the dead weight. Part of them, the dead weight. Now, are there people that the union protects? Absolutely. And should some of them maybe go by the wayside? Yeah, sure. But understand the process, understand the idea of due process. And no one I've ever talked to is against the idea of having your day in court, of having the ability to push back. This idea that union workers never get fired is just ludicrous. It's completely and totally ridiculous. But it's one of those myths that the right-wing think tanks keep throwing out there. And there's always the anecdotal tale. I know a guy who knows a guy who knew a guy who sat next to a guy on a plane. Due process is about doing your due diligence. The company can fire anybody they want if they just follow the procedure. It's kind of like if you're ever arrested. There's a process. You have due process. You get to have an attorney. You get to have a hearing. There are a lot of processes before they take your freedom away. But that's only for union workers. And it's really bizarre to me that people in this country haven't gotten the idea that there should be no such thing as at-will employment. The idea that you show up one day and you go, oh, there's the door, without any due process, without any ability to defend oneself. Look, are there people who are lazy and stupid? Sure, but they're lazy and stupid in every workplace, not just unionized workplaces. Some of the biggest right-wing organizations are filled with lazy and stupid. But for me, it's about due process. It's about doing the right thing. It's about ensuring that you follow the process. You hear this a lot about teachers. Oh, you can never fire a bad teacher. Yes, you can. And they do often. It's about administrators doing their job. So when you push back on people not getting fired because you think they're lazy and stupid, maybe the people you should be pointing at as lazy and stupid are their superiors who are supposed to make sure that they do what they're supposed to do. Just kind of a thought. Just let that sink in for just a little bit. And before you fire half of the people you work with, maybe think about what that's going to mean for you. Just kind of a thought. And finally, our final email of the day comes from Maria. She says, Rick, I wanted to say thanks for the other day when you helped defend the hard-fought rights of LGBTQ people and how you assured your listeners that a person's sexual or gender identity has nothing to do with the kind of person they are. Your response might not have been perfect, but I truly appreciate your pleas for more tolerance in the world. And look, nobody's perfect. I firmly believe that what you do within the confines of your four walls is your right. My grandfather always used to say, don't worry about me, worry about yourself. And I think if we as a society were to do that, worry about ourselves, take care of our own business, and don't worry about what others are doing with their lives, I think we'd be a much better off society. I think we'd be a much, much better off community. And maybe if we understood others and got out of their bedrooms and stopped being obsessed as a society, maybe we'd be better off. But I appreciate the emails. Again, you can email me, rick@thericksmithshow.com. If you've got anything you want to say, thoughts you want to know, I'd love to hear it. Thanks for tuning in to The Rick Smith Show here on Free Speech TV. And be sure to join us every weeknight from 9 p.m. to 11 p.m. Eastern Time at thericksmithshow.com. Follow us on Twitter at Rick Smith Show and like us on Facebook at facebook.com/The Rick Smith Show. So the Economic Policy Institute, EPI.org, their website, has a fairly comprehensive idea on how we rebuild the middle class, how we rebuild a prosperous working class. And the idea is, their name is First Day Fairness. The idea that from day one, there are certain things that are, absolute. The idea that workers should be able to fight and organize and form unions, right at the top of their list, something I've been talking about for a very long time, and do so in a way free of intimidation, free of retaliation, much like, our grandparents' generation did. I remember my grandfather saying, look, you signed a card, immediately you had a representative, you began to fight for that first contract. You began to say, this is what we demand, this is what the company does, and you begin to negotiate and you build that relationship. Instead of having this massive adversarial kind of situation that just rips people apart, it should be a much more streamlined process. And also, according to their First Day Fairness program, that first contract should actually happen. If you remember the Employee Free Choice Act, you go back to that. That was one of the three tenets of that. You had the card check portion of it, you had the mandatory first contract, and you had increased penalties on people, on employers who break the rules. All things that I think are really important. They also go into the idea that, look, unions should be able to finance themselves. End right-to-work laws immediately. And I'm in favor of that. Ban the right-to-work laws, because all they have done is lower wages, lessen health care, destroy retirement security, and create in this country the race to the bottom mentality of, hey, if we pass this poison in our state, we can steal jobs from everybody else because we can allow employers to exploit our citizens. That's the argument. It's just mind-blowing to me that happens. They also want to have workers have the ability to stand in solidarity with their coworkers. Right now, workers have the right to strike in this country. The sad, unfortunate part is if you go on strike, there's a possibility of being permanently replaced. Now, you're not fired. You're just permanently replaced. I personally have never seen the difference. And, strike replacement was the one reason I voted for Bill Clinton back in 1992, because that was important. You saw the downward slide of union density. You saw wages stagnating. You saw, people working harder, longer, less. All comes back down to union organizing and density. And the idea that, if you go on strike, it's protected and you can't be permanently replaced, I think is important. Also, I'm in favor of secondary boycotts, secondary strikes, to where you stand in solidarity with other workers like our grandparents did. Now, there are a number of pieces of legislation banging around to do some of that stuff. Patty Murray has the freedom, the Workers' Freedom to Negotiate Act. Bernie Sanders has the Workplace Democracy Act. Senator Murray also the Workplace Action for a Growing Economy Wage Act. That's there. Also Representative Cartwright here in Pennsylvania, the Public Service Freedom to Negotiate Act. All good steps in the right direction, really. Also, in looking at this plan that EPI has put forth, saying that there should be some decent quality of these jobs. You should be paid a fair minimum wage. You should get overtime when you're working extra hours. That should happen. We should have predictable work schedules, and you should be compensated in the event that they're not predictable because, hey, you've got to get to and from work, childcare, all kinds of stuff. There should be transparency in the job that you do. What are the wages? What are the benefits for everybody? Not this guessing game of, well, who's over here and who's over. It's one of the things that I talk about being a union member. Everything's written out in the contract. Every CEO in this country has a contract. They know what their conditions are. The vast majority of workers in this country don't. Now, there's a bunch of other things that they want to do as part of their first day plan. Transparency being one of them. Being able to hold employers accountable for the terms of the contract, for the terms of employment, for the conditions of employment, holding them accountable. Also protecting people against, arbitrary dismissal and unfair treatment. Ending the at-will employment regime that has gripped this country for far too long. Actually giving people a right to work seems kind of important to me. Also, giving workers their rights back. I talk about the Supreme Court and, the last term where they, across this country, the law of the land right now is your employer can walk in, slap down a piece of paper in front of you, and take away your rights to sue. Your rights to claw back wage theft. These things called forced mandatory arbitration clauses, where you give up your rights to the courts. No more class action lawsuits, no more fighting, just begging. And, there's tons of these things that go on, like ending non-compete clauses. Are you going to tell me that a guy working at a sandwich shop has to sign a non-compete clause so he can't work at another sandwich shop? This is the kind of stuff that goes on. We need massive reform of our labor law. And I look at EPI's ideas, and it's a good start. The idea that workers should have rights, the idea that there should be transparency, the idea that we should have access to our courts, the idea that we should be able to fund our unions and to join and form unions and to fight for that first contract, all common sense to me. Sadly, there's the power to be in this country that they're not going to allow this to happen. Because you go back to the Employee Free Choice Act. As bad as I thought it was still a massive step forward. And the idea of workers having rights, of you and me and our coworkers having rights, should be universal. Your constitutional rights shouldn't end at the employer's door. And sadly, what we've got is that kind of a scenario. And that's why, as I point out, the National Labor Relations Act, the original act, had not one sentence, not one line, not one word, not one syllable that gave any rights to the employer. It was about giving rights to workers because they understood the employer has all the rights, which is why we need smart policy. I'd love to hear your thoughts. You can email me, rick@thericksmithshow.com. If you missed any of the program, you can check out thericksmithshow.com. To grab the latest show. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Rick@thericksmithshow.com. Thanks so much for tuning in. We'll see you back here next week. Thanks for tuning in to The Rick Smith Show here on Free Speech TV. And be sure to join us every weeknight from 9 p.m. to 11 p.m. Eastern Time at thericksmithshow.com. Follow us on Twitter at Rick Smith Show and like us on Facebook at facebook.com/The Rick Smith Show.